Hey guys, this video is sponsored by Nvidia and MSI, so make sure to stick around until the end of the video for a breakdown on their new top tier MSI Titan 18HX A14V laptop. Well, Stellar Blade is finally here, the game featuring an attractive female protagonist that more or less broke the internet for a while there. Created by South Korean developers Shift Up and being their debut title and released exclusively for the PlayStation 5. And because PlayStation Australia were cool enough to hook me up with a review code, it's all I've been playing for the last couple of weeks. Yeah, something I've totally been playing for the plot. But memes aside, like, what is this whole thing about? Well, the story in Stellar Blade takes place in the distant future, after an alien species called the Natiba invaded Earth, forcing humanity to flee to the stars and colonize space. Some point in time we created these things called exospines, which are like special suits that let humans survive in all kinds of different climates, making space travel viable and all of that. Now set years after that original conflict, you're playing as Eve, a member of the 7th Airborne Squad sent back to the planet to try to reclaim Earth from this hostile species. Yeah, and an attack too, which doesn't really go all that well. Because as it's shown in the prologue, there's some pretty stiff resistance, with Eve being one of the only survivors. And during what's more or less like a tutorial sequence, one of the only other surviving squad members, a woman named Taki, is killed by some kind of super powerful creature.
Eve, get out of here.
All in all, like, it's a pretty cool way to set the whole thing up, really emphasizing how much the planet's gone to hell, but also introducing what's very clearly going to be the big main bad guy you'll fight at the end of the game. Anyway, soon after this, Eve is saved by a dude named Adam. Yeah, subtle.
It's nothing really.
And in case those religious undertones weren't enough for you, they soon head to a city named Zion, the last bastion for humanity where most of the survivors are still living. But before that, it scales things back a bit, where you're now in a completely different city and can get introduced to the rest of the game's mechanics at a relatively smoother pace. Being a combination of some pretty basic combat sequences, combined with a bit of platforming here and there to mix things up. Eventually, Eve and Adam meet up with a character named Lily, who's the closest thing Stellar Blade's got to Ed from Cowboy Bebop, who also seems to be wearing the most high-cut leotard in human history.
Well, I guess that settles that.
And then the three of them become pivotal to not only Zion's survival, but the fate of the entire planet.
You've got a keen eye. That's right.
Now, a lot of pre-release hype has been centered around Eve and her appearance, something which created a whole lot of discussion for a multitude of reasons.
I can see why this is so popular.
Eve's often referred to by other survivors as an angel, which really just a surface level term given to her because she fell out of the sky. And I don't know what the hiring policy must be like for these airborne squads, but most of these other members seem to be female and noticeably attractive. Which is kind of refreshing in a way as well, especially at the same time where you've got developers removing something as harmless as pin-up photos from an almost 30-year-old game. Eve's apparently based on a real-life Korean model, proving that it is entirely possible to scan someone into a video game and not make them any less attractive in the process. I mean, in fact, if anything, they've taken some physical liberties during this whole process. The thing is though, like, her appearance, it never really comes into play during the actual story. I mean, it's not like you have people commenting on how she looks directly.
I told you this would be fun.
And outside of a few camera angles here and there, which really make me think the devs knew exactly what they were doing, her appearance is almost overlooked. There's a whole bunch of different outfits to unlock as well, on a grading scale of safeness for work. You can change her hairstyle, her glasses, and even her earrings. But none of this stuff affects your basic stats or abilities in any way. And it's all really just there in case you want to play dress up. And look dog, I mean, I'm not judging. If you want to run around the desert dressed up in a miniskirt, cutting demigorgons to pieces, well, then go for it.
To deny our own impulses is to deny the very thing that makes us human.
Buying different stuff from different merchants levels up your affinity with them, but then about all that seems to achieve is just giving you more cosmetic items to buy, and it doesn't really change how people seem to treat you overall.
That's all you're getting out of me.
There's some really deep and complex themes here too that the story explores, with things like religion, angels and demons, humanity, what defines good and evil, along with having some surprisingly well written and poignant side content too. But most people are probably just going to overlook that and buy the game regardless, simply just because of how the main character looks, which is fine.
Not that there's anything wrong with that.
No, of course not.
I will say too that it is absolutely insane that they didn't include some kind of photo mode. I mean, considering all the chaotic combat and those customization options for Eve, along with the serene and often gorgeous backdrops, to not let the player take a bunch of happy snaps along the way, it just seems like a real missed opportunity. I mean, for a game with this much side boob, not to mention fully modeled thigh fat, it's almost kind of criminal to remove such a coveted feature.
Come on, baby, give it to me. Yes, yes, yes. No, no!
Anyway, Eve's overall goal is to find these things called alpha cores, retrieve from beating these alpha Natibas, and then using them to power up Zion or something like that. And yeah, like all Sony exclusives, there is a high focus on storytelling and cinematics, with some pretty frequent and lengthy cutscenes where people all stand around talking, all of which, by the way, is completely unskippable. In fact, even for all the random dialogue with the NPCs, you can't skip over this stuff either. You can kind of fast track your way through it by mashing the X button over and over to get to that next line of dialogue, but I think doing this for every conversation is going to lead with RSI.
Yes, a formidable monster.
It is worth noting as well that the voice acting across the board is pretty damn bad. And I don't know if something's been lost in translation, but all of the characters just sound so bored and stiff.
I'm Royal Guard Quiel. I'm under direct orders from Oracle to protect the ruins.
Okie dokie.
Eve, for instance, has about as much personality as an ironing board, and some of the side characters genuinely come across as if someone's just used a text-to-speech program to record their lines.
Oh, no. You can just take this. I heard you've come to help us.
Just like everyone has one emotion they carry throughout the entire game, and even when Eve's thrown into these nasty ambushes or encounters against these humongous Natibas, she barely seems to sound concerned at all.
Adam, get back!
But then Lily, on the other hand, just sounds like every single cliche tech geek character in every form of media ever, with that kind of high-pitched enthusiasm that just makes you want to stuff a pair of socks in her mouth.
If you try jumping, I bet you'll notice the difference.
It's just a bit removed from other Sony exclusives, where you've got these fully motion captured and voice acted scenes that really could have come right out of an actual film or a TV show.
I'm glad I was able to do something of significance.
As for the actual gameplay, well, Stellar Blade is more or less a Souls-like hack and slash combined with some basic RPG elements, which means that along with the main story missions, you've got a couple of dozen distractions along the way. And it is actually kind of impressive just how much content and variety there actually is. What starts out as a fairly linear experience, moving through a ruined city to fight that first alpha, ends up with Eve arriving in Zion and then that place becoming a sort of base of operations. After that, you get to explore a vast open wasteland, completing a whole bunch of new missions, before it then goes linear again for the second and the third alpha fight. Followed after that by heading to the desert for yet another opened up area to explore, this time dodging quicksand, enemies that literally come out of the ground to attack you, and navigating the crumbling ruins of a city that's been swallowed up by the elements. There's even a few times when you've got to head deeper underground because there's too much panic in this town, forced to only use your ranged weapons, fighting back against what's more or less zombies. So, if nothing else, there is a fair bit of variety going on here with all these backdrops. To be honest though, outside of the protagonist, whose appearance is often downright distracting, there's not really anything groundbreaking or all that amazingly unique about Stellar Blade. Visually, it definitely looks pretty damn good, with some nice detailed environments and great animations, but then again, like, you've kind of come to expect that for a PS5 title anyway. The modelling for the main characters, like Eve, Adam and Lily, are all of a really high standard, but then the modelling for some of the random NPCs you interact with is definitely not on the same level, creating this really weird juxtaposition between the two.
Let's leave it at that. Goodbye.
In the performance mode, there's an overall steady frame rate and it never becomes an issue, but then put the game into the so-called resolution mode and it instantly takes a hit, to the point that I found the combat pretty much unplayable. And on that note, the combat feels like your typical Souls-like experience, which means it's mostly focused on dodging and parrying at just the right time, opening up all these various counterattacks. There's no ridiculous combos to rack up, but about the most complicated it gets there is just alternating between pressing light and heavy attack. So in that way, it's far more Dark Souls than it is Devil May Cry, let's put it that way. You've got limited healing items, and once these are gone, the only way to stock up again is by resting at various camps speckled throughout each area. And because it's a Souls-like game, every time you stop to rest, nearby enemies are going to respawn.
Of course.
Now, truth be told, I'm not the biggest fan of these kinds of games, and in fact, I've never finished a single FromSoft game ever.
Come again?
But that was something that I didn't have an issue with here in Stellar Blade. And a big reason for that was obviously what I was staring at the entire time, but also I think because Stellar Blade does feel a lot more forgiving than other games in the same genre. I mean, you still to get your fair share of bosses here and there, and these guys can easily smash you into the ground like pizza dough, but campsites are usually within arm's reach of these encounters. What I also thought was a god tier quality of life feature is that whenever you finish a main or a side mission, the game has the option to fast travel directly back to that NPC who gave it to you.
Let's go. There's nothing left for us to do here.
Sidestepping again, the completely pointless time wasting you would have spent getting back there manually. And I just also find the combat more rewarding because of the whole parrying and dodging system. So the way it works is you guard from attacks by holding down L1, but if you press L1 just before an attack connects, you get a perfect parry. Staggering an enemy if it's the last hit in their combo, and then opening up a whole bunch of options there to retaliate. It's not really anything new though, and I think almost every video game we've had in the last decade has used some kind of variant of this system. But as is usually the case there too, it's an important trick to get the hang of, because pulling off perfectly timed dodges or parries builds up something called your beta meter. And when you've got enough of this stuff built up, by holding down L1 and pressing one of the face buttons, you can then pull off one of 4 different abilities. One of which, for instance, helps to remove an enemy shield, which becomes absolutely essential during the tougher fights. But then there's also just beta skills here that really become handy for basic crowd control. To make the whole thing even more confusing, near the end of the game, you'll unlock the burst moves, which are bound to R1 and have more or less the exact same functions. Different exospines and gear you find along the way let you customize the kind of playstyle you want here as well. Like the one that I had on the most there was the one that increases the damage your beta moves do, and then another one reduces the enemy's detection range, you know, in case you want to hang back and stab things in the ass.
Got your ass.
And I really appreciate here too how the game lets you sneak up behind unaware enemies and ambush them for a quick and easy kill, letting me bypass some of those really annoying enemy types entirely. I mean, there's enemies in here that are such a fucking pain in the ass to deal with that it almost had me throwing my controller through the window. Like one of them is just a random tentacle that comes out of the ground. I mean, what is this, Doom Eternal? And any kind of enemy that just spits at you from a distance can piss right off too. I mean, look man, I enjoy a straight up fight as much as the next bloke, but sometimes you just need to sneak up behind a giant alien pig man and drive your blade through his spinal column.
Let me see that again. I didn't get a good look at that.
Eve does start off being pretty weak by design, and in fact during that opening prologue she's more or less completely naked, which might explain why she gets her ass handed to her so easily.
My body frame.
But then within like a matter of hours, and after racking up a bunch of experience points and completing missions, you start unlocking some of those better moves, and then the combat becomes a lot more open-ended. And there's 2 main things you need to worry about with the enemies here, and that's their balance and their shield. Now the shield is more or less just like an extra health bar, but if you manage to knock these guys off balance, well, it leaves them wide open to a powerful retribution attack, which then wipes out most of their health bar in a single hit. And that right there, along with getting the hang of the parrying system, also opens up some pretty nasty counterattacks, a lot of which can be stacked to do even more damage. I mean, even just something as simple as unlocking the ability to charge into enemies from a distance goes a long way in giving you more control over a fight, really making you feel like more than just a punching bag with a perfectly shaped ass. And then about halfway through the campaign you unlock a ranged weapon, which has a bunch of different firing modes as well, from what's basically like an automatic pistol, along with a shotgun, railgun, and even a missile launcher. so you can see that there's a whole heap of stuff to contend with here. And by the end of the game, you've got about 4 or 5 different systems you're trying to constantly keep track of and micromanage. And although you can kind of get away with playing aggressively, I found the best course of action is reaction. Reading those enemy animations and watching out for those highly telegraphed attacks. And I think Bruce Lee summed it up best. When the opponent expands, I contract, and when he contracts, I expand. Makes sense? Good.
Right, if you insist.
Either way though, this is yet again another one of those games where enemies can kill you in a matter of hits, with even the trash mobs you fight early on still able to ruin your day pretty quickly. And overall, it is a decent enough combat system, but as soon as you get more than 1 or 2 enemies attacking you at once, the whole thing just often goes to hell. And because your crowd control moves are limited to your beta and your burst moves, if you've got no energy for either of these, well, it can leave you up shit creek without a paddle. Those few times you're inside some kind of interior area is where the camera becomes your worst foe as well, and making those moments way tougher than they should be. And can I just point out too how wild it is that we're in 2024 here, and we're still dealing with shoddy camera issues in video games. By default as well, the game's got this control scheme where it automatically locks onto an enemy that you're attacking, which I just found to be incredibly annoying when I had to deal with multiple enemies at once. So look man, my advice there is to turn that shit off as soon as possible. I'm not sure if it's a skill issue either, but there was times when my parries and combos just didn't seem to register. Like the game just completely ignored my inputs. And despite me having pulled off a perfect parry half a dozen times in a row, for the next 3 or 4 instances I couldn't get it working to save my life. Literally. And funnily enough, I actually found some of the boss fights to be the easiest moments in the game, simply because their larger size makes it a lot easier to read their movements. But also because I didn't have 3 or 4 other fucking assholes joining in the fray and trying to hit me from my blind side. Don't get me wrong though, the boss fights in this game are still very challenging, with some of them just being absolutely relentless. I am proud to say though that I managed to fumble my way through a lot of them on my first attempt, but even still man, I was getting thrown around there like dirty laundry. And towards the end of the story, the difficulty takes a humongous spike, with the last few major boss fights just being insane. So if you've been half-assing your way through these up until that point, well then you can expect to get your ass handed to you a lot, which I did. And that kind of brings me on to the biggest problem I started to have here, and that's that whenever you're killed, the game isn't reloading you from your last save point. What it is instead doing is reviving you in your current state, which means that all of the resources you just spent before you got killed don't carry over. That is to say, if you just spend all this money buying ammo for your weapons, stocking up on healing items, and making sure your special meters are fully charged up and ready to go, well then I'm sorry to say, but all of that stuff is going to be gone when you're killed, which really puts you at a massive disadvantage for subsequent attempts.
Piss.
And although you could easily go back and rebuy all of this stuff at camp, that really does become economically unfeasible the longer you get stuck on a particular boss. Stellar Blade also does get kinda lazy in the late game, outright recycling earlier boss fights, only just giving these guys a lot more health points and making them do a lot more damage. To the point that I genuinely thought one of these was actually broken. At one point too, out of curiosity during this tougher boss, I dropped the difficulty down to the so-called story mode to see if it was any easier, and amazingly, it really wasn't. Which is good news in the sense that it kind of shows you really need to have a handle on how all of these combat features work, but it's bad news in the sense that there's going to be a lot of sore-headed journalists struggling to get through some of these encounters. And not understanding or implementing the basics of the combat mechanics is going to have you staring at that revive screen over, and over. And I get it, for some people there is an appeal there to dying to the same boss 20 times until you finally learn the rote of the whole thing, figuring out the frame precise timing for pressing L1 or the circle button. At least there doesn't seem to be any real penalty for dying there. I mean, you're not losing souls or anything. Just comes back to whether or not you're going to be rebuying items after each death. Most of the time as well, I often had enough money to buy the items or ammo I needed. I always had enough resources to upgrade my stats. and I also made sure I had enough resources so I could buy whatever new outfit I just unlocked for Eve.
Your concern is appreciated.
And truly where I had the most fun playing this game was when I was just running around doing my own thing, exploring those few opened up side areas, or going back to the other areas I'd already completed to do some of the side missions. I mean, look, the story itself is fine, but the sense of escapism and exploration you get from getting lost in Stellar Blade's game world was just far more engaging to me. If nothing else, it meant I didn't always have to listen to Lily's voice acting.
But you can just call me Lily.
And even after like 15 or so hours, the game was still introducing new mechanics. Like how you can throw a line out in small lakes to catch different kinds of fish, which is a whole separate minigame with its own leveling up system. The only real aspect of the game that feels severely undercooked is the swimming and the platforming. And I don't know, like maybe I've just become accustomed to how swimming feels in other games, but either way, in Stellar Blade, it just feels like complete shit. All you should have to do when swimming in a video game is aim in the direction you want to swim, and then hold down a button to move in that direction. But in Stellar Blade, it's got this system where you press buttons to ascend or descend, along with a separate button for faster swimming, which sounds fine on paper, but half the time it doesn't even seem to work. And it really got to the point where I just hated having to go swimming, because I just knew that it was going to be a hassle.
I'd like to avoid getting wet.
That's what she said.
The platforming also feels very shoddy, with Eve often just ignoring the object you're trying to jump towards, and because fall damage is a real thing in this game, that becomes a huge issue. Now, the biggest point of comparison I could make there is to the Uncharted games, which really is the closest thing that Stellar Blade feels like. And if you're used to how jumping and climbing feels like in those games, well, then the platforming in Stellar Blade is going to be startlingly bad. Some of these mechanics also just feel like a bit of an afterthought, like they introduce wall running after a bunch of hours, but then I think the amount of times you actually need to wall run can be counted on one hand.
Wow, great moves. Almost as good as mine.
I don't know, maybe someone played Jedi Survivor during the development cycle and just wanted to add it in. Same thing with the double jumping, which I only managed to unlock after doing a random side mission, but again was something that you never actually need to get through an area. The underground and interior areas don't have a map screen either, so navigating through these areas, not to mention going back there to try to complete the side missions, becomes a very confusing ordeal, where you often can't find that one specific place you need to be.
This way.
You might get a rough idea on your radar as to which direction you got to head, but some of these environments are really lengthy and complex, and it can be kind of hard to put a pinpoint on the exact spot you need to go. Also, considering you can't really avoid combat in these areas, it becomes this frustrating process of having to clear house before you can even try to get your bearings. And not every campsite has a fast travel point either, so bypassing the entire area isn't possible. Finally, like most Sony exclusives, this thing has no idea when to quit, with the main story just going on and on.
That's amazing, Lily.
Even when you get to that point of no return message where it tells you that you're locking yourself into the final few parts of the campaign, in actuality, you've still got another 5 or 6 hours to go at least.
I didn't understand what you said.
And then every time it feels like the story's finally coming to an end after some kind of humongous boss fight that just rages on and on, you instead just keep on playing, and then end up fighting yet another one just half an hour later. I mean, it just got to the point there where I just started to get fatigued, and any one of these could have easily served as the final boss. But I guess if nothing else, at least there's a whole lot of value there in Stellar Blade's campaign, and that main story alone is going to take you a good 20 or so hours to get through. And the one thing you can't fault these Sony games for is the bang for the buck.
He's right, you know.
Do I think Stellar Blade is any kind of masterpiece or must-play experience though? Well, no, not really. I mean, the whole premise of a post-apocalyptic wasteland in the distant future, patrolled by hostile aliens and robotic creatures, it ain't entirely new, is it? And playing as a 20-something-year-old female protagonist who looks like she's made out of porcelain is almost par for the course for these kind of titles as well. I'm not saying it's a bad game though, in fact, it's quite the opposite. And if you got a PS5, well, then the answer's even more simple, in that, of course you should play it. I mean, what else are you gonna do?
You have no imagination.
But I don't think Xbox fans really need to worry too much about missing out on anything all that amazing or life-changing. And if all you're worried about there is missing out on a bit of eye candy, well, then the internet's got a solution to that too. Right, so let's chat about the MSI Titan 18HX A14V laptop. As a study buddy or for creators, the Titan lives up to its namesake with a lot of power to spare. Throw whatever work or play software you like at it and the Titan's built to keep up. Plus you get to enjoy the on-screen results via the world's first 18-inch 4K mini LED display. For gaming, choose up to an Nvidia GeForce RTX 4090 laptop GPU to get the ultimate experience for games like Horizon Forbidden West Complete Edition with all of the maximum settings. And Horizon Forbidden West Complete Edition is one of a bunch of games where you can get an AI assist from Nvidia, use DLLA at high resolutions for max image quality, or switch on DLSS 3 to play at higher frame rates and take full advantage of the 4K 120Hz screen. While DLSS 3 ups the frame rate, Nvidia Reflex lowers system latency for snappier responsiveness. So yeah, this MSI laptop is built for maxed out solo gaming and twitchy online multiplayer. So to get more info on the MSI Titan 18 HX A14V laptop, click on the link in the video description.